Welcome back, everyone. We've been talking about the conflict in the Middle East. Marc Lamont Hill anchors Black News Tonight here on BNC at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. He also happens to be an expert on U.S. policy in that region, having also authored a book as well. Marc, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Great, great. So I was asking you earlier, why should Americans care and be concerned about what's going on there in the Middle East when there's so many problems here at home?
Well, there are a few reasons why Americans should be concerned about what's happening in the Middle East in general. One is, of course, the kind of funding tied to Middle East countries. The United States is the biggest funder of the state of Israel. We're also the biggest funder of Egypt. We also fund Afghanistan. And so when you look at policy in that region, when you look at the political directions of a country, you certainly have to be accountable for the ways that your tax dollars go. So as an American, if I say, hey, I want more infrastructure here, I want more schools here, I want more funding here or there, then we have to say, well, where are we spending the money? And a huge part of our money goes certainly to the Israeli military as well as the other countries that I mentioned. The other reason why we should care is that the United States has always had a very strategic and opportunistic relationship to the Middle East. That our position in Sudan, or our position on Saudi Arabia or Yemen or Syria is always directly informed by our needs and our interests and our aspirations. And so whenever the United States is making a move or making a judgment, it's not based on feeling, it's based on interest. So as Americans, we should be paying careful attention. And then the last reason is a very, and for me, the best one, and that is we should have an ethical and moral interest in whatever's happening in a country where people are being harmed, where violence is happening, where people are being displaced, or where other forms of violence are occurring. We should be on top of it like all human beings should.
Absolutely. Of course, we know it's all about money sometimes. Marc, I know you are, like me, you're always in the digital streets, as you call it. Celebrities like Rihanna have been speaking out using social media to call attention to this centuries-old conflict. Rihanna tweeting out that she, felt bad for the children of both Israel and Palestine. Do you think that type of attention can help this?
Drawing attention to what's going on is always helpful in the abstract, but we have to be careful not to issue statements that make things seem like they are moral equivalents. In other words, I'm happy that Rihanna's interested in Israel and Palestine, and there's no bigger Rihanna fan in the world than me. But at the very same time, we want to be careful that we don't say things like, both sides of this conflict need to manage this, or both sides need to do better, or I feel bad for both sides. Of course, we don't want any harm to happen to any children. Israeli lives, Jewish lives are worth just as much as Black lives, brown lives, Arab lives, Palestinian lives. All babies are worth the same, and they all deserve our protection and our care. But we also have to say that this is not a conflict that has emerged between two people who just have a dispute over property. This isn't a real estate battle, and this isn't a real estate battle. This is about the displacement, the dislocation, and ultimately the colonizing of a vulnerable people in the Middle East. And so I'm always wary of celebrities who use the both sides argument. It would be like if in South Africa in the 1980s and even the early 90s, we said, I feel bad for South African babies and Afrikaner babies. Now, both sides to get this thing together. I mean, there's a layer of truth to that, but at the core, we understood that the Afrikaners were in a position of power. We understood in the 1950s that Bull Connor was in the wrong. And so when we see Palestinian families evicted from Sheikh Jarrah in the Jerusalem governorate right now, we have, this isn't a both sides argument. Their international rights are being violated. And when we see the disproportionate force being used against Palestinians in Gaza, we have to say this is wrong. Now, there's room to have critique. People can raise questions about Hamas. They can talk about the targeting of civilians. They can talk about indiscriminate rocket fire. We can have a complex and nuanceation. But at the core, this is not a conflict between two equally weighted sides. One has power here.
But Israel is saying that this is the fault of Hamas, and they say they're not backing down. And in the meantime, the United States has sent over a diplomat. So what's the United States' obligation in this conflict? And should they, along with the United Nations, be doing something? What is your perspective in terms of what you just said, that these are not two equal powers at conflict?
Yeah. I mean, it's part of the challenge, right? Is that the United States has made it very clear that it's not going to be a neutral arbiter. The United States, at various moments in history, has attempted to bring about peace, to come with different types of solutions, ostensibly. But at the core, the United States has always said, and they're very unabashed in saying, that we stand with Israel, that we are allies and friends to Israel, that Israel's security is paramount. And so when you begin the conversation with that position, it's going to be very challenging to earn the trust of Palestinians and to negotiate in good faith for both sides. Israel says it's not backing down, and they blame Hamas, but we have to be very clear here. Hamas was created in 1987. The type of oppression that Palestinians are facing goes back to the end century, and certainly since what they call the Nakba of 1948. The United States has been the biggest backer of Israel since 1967, since the what they call the 1967 or Six-Day War. So this is not a recent thing, and all of it goes before Hamas. Again, there are criticisms to be made of Hamas. 2 nights ago, I had Orula Jibril on my show, and she very clearly said, look, most Palestinians aren't fans of Hamas. Hamas might be a thorn in the side of Israel, but it's not that Palestinians are standing in line to vote for Hamas. In fact, there hasn't been an election since 2005. But the issue is that, one, for moderate leadership, if there's no space to have free elections or to have free governance without the kind of the blockade and the occupation of the land by the state of Israel. But there's also this question of saying, yeah, what Hamas is attempting to respond to something. Again, we can be critical of Hamas. Hamas is not perfect. Hamas is not blameless here. But this what we're dealing with here didn't start in 1987 with Hamas. It didn't start with the taking over of the Gaza Strip. What it started with was the dislocation and the displacement of over 750,000 Palestinians in December of 1947 through the beginning of 1949. What started this was the loss of land, the loss of opportunity, and this is where the crisis begins. It's the loss of human rights. It's the fact that people in the West Bank don't have freedom of movement. It's the fact that the Palestinian citizens of Israel don't have full citizenship. On paper they do, but in practice they don't. It's the fact that there are millions of refugees around the country who could never go home again. This is what's happening. And the fact that you see evictions in Jerusalem constantly is an index of just the kind of problems that we're talking about. And so we can look to Hamas, but that's not the starting place. But they become a convenient scapegoat. And it's very interesting how the conversation shifts from Thursday or Friday of last week, where we were having a very important conversation about home evictions and the violation of international law and displacing our occupied people. And suddenly, like clockwork, we flipped to Hamas. And the Biden administration finally has not done much to resolve any of this. They've essentially said, we're going to stand pat and do nothing. We don't want to deal with the Middle East. He's much more like Ronald Reagan in that way. Like, I'd rather this not be my primary issue, but his hand is being forced right now. And because his hand is being forced, he's now going to stand up and affirmatively say, I support the state of Israel. But what that means for Palestinians remains to be seen.
Well, so much more to talk about on this issue, Marc, but we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. And I know that you will probably, as always, have more analysis for us on your show, Black News Tonight at 8 p.m.
Absolutely.
with Marc Lamont Hill. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you later. Take care.
My pleasure.